Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Beyond Train podcast. I'm your host, Liam Dalton. Very special episode today, episode 52. That marks 1 year of doing the podcast. It's pretty exciting. I'm pretty excited about it. We got a great guest today in a fascinating topic, German New Medicine. This topic interests me so much, and I don't know enough about it. And so I'm learning here. You guys are learning. This is just the most perfect episode to have on the 1 year mark. Um, we have Abigail Puccioni here, and I'm super eager to hear her perspectives. We're going to delve maybe a little deeper into German New Medicine today. We had a great introductory type episode with Melissa Sell there earlier, so it might be beneficial to go back and listen to that before you dig into this episode here. So, Abigail, thank you so much for coming on today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Awesome. So, first of all, I want to get your take on health, your definition of health, what it means, what it looks like, how it manifests. You can take it any direction you want, but what is health?
Okay. Oh, this is a juicy question. Putting me on the spot here. Let's see. I guess my definition of health, now that I know about German New Medicine and the five biological laws, I would really define health as your perception. Um, I think that's ultimately what it boils down to because the way that our psyche is perceiving the world around us is what will determine the tissue adaptations that take place in the body. So, of course, and I know Dr. Melissa Sell, who is one of my mentors, in the episode that she did with you, which I listened to, she goes over this about the three exceptions. So, of course, there's injury, malnutrition, or toxicity, like poisoning, and those are exceptions to the five biological laws. But fundamentally, my understanding of health is going to be perception based. So the symptoms that we end up experiencing, almost all of them are going to be coming from our perception of the world around us.
Well put. Yeah, and so we kind of reduce disease to being caused by toxicities, deficiencies, or traumas, and we kind of distinguish between physical and psychological traumas. So I guess German medicine is really dealing with what I would always say are the psychological traumas in a way. Not that the word trauma is necessarily used, though.
Mhm. Right. So for a conflict shock, for something, a traumatic event, let's say, to qualify as a conflict shock as we know it through the lens of GNM, it has to be highly acute, distressing, and catch you off guard. And you had to feel emotionally isolated in the moment. So the biggest one for me, though, the biggest kind of criteria there that I always look for is that element of shock or surprise that it caught you unprepared. You were not expecting it. And you also mentioned, toxins, right? And even traumas. I feel like they get grouped in together a lot. And so people, are like, oh, toxins are out to get me, right? There's this bad external thing. And this could be viruses, toxins, germs, whatever you want to say. There's this external bad guy that's out to get you. Right. And so a lot of people, even in the mind body realm, they will start to view emotions and traumas in the same way. Like, oh, this bad emotion is stuck in my body somewhere, or I have this, anger trapped in my liver or something like that, which, is that helpful to view it in that way? Right. And I'm not saying that there's no truth to this view of the body, but because certainly the mind body connection is a huge part of understanding German New Medicine. That's really, I would say, fundamental to making this paradigm shift. And certainly that's how I got into German New Medicine, is starting to ask a lot of questions and going from the integrative health world into kind of the mind body realm. And then I found GNM, and that's when it was this really light bulb moment and everything just kind of fell into place. And it was like, oh my gosh, this is the framework for understanding what I already intuitively knew to be true. And I think that's the beautiful thing about GNM and the five biological laws. It goes by other names too. Germanische Heilkunde is the official name in German, or Germanic healing knowledge, or La Medicina Sagrada in Spanish, the sacred medicine. And all of those are such beautiful names. I also like the Germanic healing framework, but it's usually, at least in the US, it goes by German New Medicine, GNM. So I just kind of call it that so people know what I'm talking about. But yeah, this framework for understanding health in the body, and that everything we experience physically, as far as symptoms, is coming from a conflict shock that you experienced, a moment in which you were caught off guard, emotionally unprepared for that, in which you felt emotionally isolated in that moment. And of course, it was distressing. This isn't the surprise of a surprise birthday party, which for most people might be a more positive being caught off guard. But this is a more of a negative caught off guard. And really, the simplest way to understand a conflict shock is anything that you were not emotionally prepared for, something that you were, and biologically, I would say. I always say that GNM is not psychosomatic. I like to use the term psychobiological. So it's something that you were not prepared for that caught you off guard. And in that moment, your body starts adapting. And Melissa goes over this really well in the episode she did with you. There are different patterns of adaptation depending on which tissue layer is affected. And then we get into talking about, the different parts of the brain that control the different tissue layers, because Dr. Hammer, the guy who discovered German New Medicine, he based all of his discoveries essentially in the study of embryology. And so this is really where it's coming from. So yeah, going all the way back, I kind of started to go on a tangent there, but what you brought up about trauma and even toxins, trauma is not just the equivalent of a toxin, right? This bad thing that happened that's causing bad things in the body. But rather, if there's a moment in which you are caught off guard by something and your body deems it advantageous for your survival to try to help you adapt, it's actually biologically meaningful and biologically sensical. And so this is the essence of this huge paradigm shift, is really reframing things to view symptoms in the body as for the vast majority of symptoms, they're signs that you've resolved the conflict and that you're now in the healing phase or the repair phase. And your symptoms are actually evidence of that tissue restoration process taking place.
Yeah, very well put. Um, yeah, we take a very similar lens here. The demonization of symptoms and
Mm.
of, even the word trauma for considering like psychological traumas. I don't like calling it that. I always have like a little asterisk on like a trauma. Like, these are events that shape our worldview, and um, our bodies and our minds adapt, right? We adapt to
Mm.
things that happen to us, and there may be times where it might become maladaptive down the road, where it's no longer serving us, or things
Mhm.
of that nature. But again, it's like, there's this sort of distinction in the mental health field now, that it's like big T trauma versus little t
Mhm.
trauma. And we're talking about big, huge traumatic events, like maybe going to war, or, seeing
Sure.
somebody close to you die, or different things like that. And those might be extremely traumatic events. But, you know, little things like, you know, things you wouldn't necessarily deem as a trauma, can still play an effect on your body, like you're talking about here. Anything that kind of puts you in a distressed state, right? So, um, being caught off guard, and then our bodies and our minds have to adapt to this. I think you really put that beautifully. And so, um, there's a problem, I think, in this new sort of new wave holistic paradigm that's going on. Um, like we talk about naturopaths often employing a completely allopathic model. You go and, at least from what I've heard, I've never gone to see a naturopath. I know there are great naturopaths out there. I'm not trying to speak of them as a field, but I feel like generally, they're employing this supplement to fix your problems, right? And there's vested interest there. And in selling these supplements and things like that. And it's kind of still an allopathic fix. It's like, oh, you're low in this vitamin, give you this vitamin, and but there's something deeper going on with that imbalance, and it's not being addressed. Um, Different things like that. So I feel like we've kind of been greenwashed and tricked in that way a little bit. Uh, but I think what you're talking about here and this difference in this whole shift is just a more positive outlook on what's going on. Like for us, it's we look a lot at germs and things like that. And, these are not to be demonized. They are serving a very important purpose in our body. When they are at the site of disease, they're cleaning things up. They are not the root cause of an illness. Often there's something that lies deeper that needs to be addressed. So, um, very well put. Very well put. Anything you want to add to that, or
Yeah, you mentioned the trauma thing and how a lot of people can get really hung up on that and using that language and oh, I have all this trauma stuck in my tissues and I need to get it out. Is it helpful to view your body in that way? Right? And also what I find even in the GNM world, people will view, let's say, conflict shocks that maybe they experienced in childhood that started an adaptation and then it, becomes what we call a hanging healing when the healing process is never able to fully finish out because you step on what we call a track, or you can think of it as a trigger. And I can dive more into that in a moment if you'd like, but basically people get really caught up on looking back at the past and thinking about, oh, okay, oh, my dad caused this conflict shock for me, or my mom is the reason I have this conflict, right? And what is that doing? That's keeping them in a state of victimhood and not taking radical responsibility for their health. And therefore, they won't be able to access their greatest amount of personal freedom. And for me, and they have every right to do that, right? There is stuff, I mean, every single client I work with has had stuff happen to them that should not have happened to them, that is not right, that is not fair. They didn't have, their parents showing up for them in the way that they deserved as a child, right? And so ultimately, this is about recognizing, okay, maybe this adaptation started in childhood, or maybe it started later, but in childhood, our perceptions are being primed, our psyches are being primed to see the world in a certain way. And of course, this starts in childhood. It starts from the moment of conception, I believe. Our the way that we view the world around us is inevitably shaped by parents and our community and the culture in which we're raised, the stuff we watch on TV growing up, our childhood friends, family dynamics, what the aunts and uncles and grandparents are saying as they sit around the table at family gatherings, right? This all shapes our perception. And so people can obviously have the freedom to go back and be like, oh, that conflict shock was because my parents had this fight. And so what does that do? That keeps them feeling a bit stuck and hopeless and how to actually resolve it and move forward, because they're not really aware of the personal freedom that they have available to them, which is really to understand that, okay, maybe this started here and this is how it's really all about awareness. And I know Melissa emphasized this as well. When they have awareness of perhaps where it started, instead of playing the blame game and remaining in that state of victimhood, how can we actually, through awareness, recognize where it started, but then take our own power back and move forward with realizing I'm no longer that little kid, that has these needs that a child has, right? Or I'm no longer in that vulnerable state. I'm an adult. I have personal freedom. I can choose to craft my life into moving more towards what I want.
and I guess that's all just a part of the process
Yeah.
of growing up, right? Yeah,
Yes.
I remember, Dr. Gabe Roberts mentioned, we're all victims of our childhood in some respect,
Yes.
right? It's that's what shapes our worldview, and so our worldview as a child might be different than what is gonna serve us as an adult, right?
Mhm.
And, sometimes we're gonna have to shift our worldview, and sometimes that's not a simple thing to do, right? Because our mind is very interesting in this respect, where, once we adapt to something, we kinda get into this stuck in this mindset, and you have to really do something, take a step back and realize, okay, like, you can do something about it, but that responsibility piece is huge, is absolutely huge. And Um, to me, that seems to be the biggest hold back on society nowadays. It seems like there's a lack of
Yeah.
responsibility and a lot of victimhood. But you mentioned tracks and triggers.
Yeah.
You want to expand on that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. The concept of a
Thank
hanging
you.
healing. So I always use the same example to explain this. One of my friends was like, wow, that's a really violent example. And I'm like, well, I guess I'm just in the post-mortal constellation. I don't know. Which we can get into what a constellation is later on. But anyway, imagine that you got stabbed by a knife, right? A stab wound in the arm. Well, the body will naturally start to repair that tissue, of course. We see this all the time, even just from a little scratch. Our body repairs itself, it knows what to do. So, maybe you put a bandage on it, you kind of get the bleeding to stop, right? And then eventually the skin will try to move back together. It will start that repair process and it will probably be really painful and swollen and a lot of inflammation, right? Or could even have what we would call an infection, which is just the body moving through a repair phase being assisted by microbes, which, as you said earlier, are our little helpers. They're the cleanup crew, they're the repair crew, right? So anyway, we know that the body does that. So imagine though that the very next day, you have it bandaged up, you take the band-aid off and you re-stab yourself, just with a little tiny knife. You just kind of keep poking it, you keep picking at it, you keep picking the scab off, right? Is that ever going to really heal? When you keep interrupting the repair phase process, you're not allowing the body to finish that tissue restoration process. So, of course, in the stab wound example, the stab wound is like experiencing a conflict shock. So we experienced something that caught us off guard, right? That we felt emotionally isolated, unprepared for, something, that we weren't able to handle and process fully in that moment. And then what a track is, or we could think of it as just a trigger, is basically sticking something in that wound every day. So, imagine you have a fight with your partner that caught you off guard and you experienced a conflict shock from that, and the body starts to adapt in some way. Well, then the next day, maybe you don't actually get in like a fight again, but say your partner becomes a track for you. So seeing that person, or it could even be specifically seeing that person in the kitchen where the fight occurred, or the track might not even be your partner. The track could be, say, if you were in the kitchen cooking when it occurred, being in the kitchen cooking could become a track, or if you got shocking news from a text message, you were on your phone and you opened a text message and you find out something, shocking, right? Catches you off guard. Someone said something nasty about you or left a nasty comment on your Instagram or something. You see that. Well, guess what? Picking up your phone or opening up Instagram could become a track or a trigger. And so when that's happening on a sometimes daily basis or even multiple times per day, it's no surprise that we then have chronic symptoms where the body will naturally start to move into resolution. So say if we do find a moment where we resolve the conflict, we make up with our partner, we have a conversation, but then the next day, maybe they use a tone of voice. That's not quite a fight, but as maybe that tone of voice is a red flag to our psyche, and these alarm bells start going off in the psyche, like, oh, we need to go ahead and run this biological program. We need to go ahead and start this tissue adaptation to go ahead and help you in advance, because last time your partner used this tone of voice, something bad happened that caught you off guard. So now, in case this happens again, we're going to go ahead and start adapting early. So it's basically the body being very proactive. And so that's really what a track or a trigger is. And I think people will probably resonate with the word trigger because I think that's used quite frequently, like, oh, like, I don't know, bad weather is a trigger for my headaches. Well, I wonder why. You probably experienced a conflict shock when that bad weather was occurring. And so we use the language in GNM that got tracked in. So that got tracked in as a trigger. And so that now becomes something that in your psyche, it's like this alarm system. And so your body, and all of its infinite intelligence and wisdom, starts running that adaptation for you. And so that's essentially the GNM perspective on chronic symptoms.
Amazing. Well put again. Yeah, it's That is certainly the popular one, get triggered. I think
Yeah.
using the popular language can be really helpful and trying to convey this information. So that's good. That's good. But I like that the idea of tracking it in. Yeah, that's
Mhm.
interesting.
But
Really
just
cool.
as a side note, this is all subconscious. So it's not like when someone says, "Ooh, I feel triggered," that they've brought that into their conscious awareness, which is great, and they're aware that this particular person triggers them, right? At least emotionally gets them feeling activated. But what I'm talking about here is actually more accessing our primal animal mind, if you will, and the subconscious. So a lot of times people will have tracks and have no clue that that's a track for them. They really are not aware of it at all. And actually, that's part of the work that I do with clients to help dissolve tracks. I mean, allergies are a great example of tracks. That's a perfect example. So when you bring it into conscious awareness and like, oh, the apple is actually not the problem. It's that I experienced a conflict shock 5 years ago while I was eating an apple. Oh, okay, this makes sense now because I wasn't allergic to apples my whole entire life, right? It started 5 years ago, is when I started reacting to this thing. And so it makes sense then that, well, when it can make sense to that person, that is what can actually help to resolve the tracks.
So kind of bringing it into that conscious awareness is a big part of healing these conflicts.
Yeah, well, I'm specifically talking about tracks, but yes, also
About
with
tracks.
conflicts. When
Okay.
someone, and I'm not saying that just bringing it into your conscious awareness is enough in and of itself, but sometimes it is.
Okay. Really cool. Really cool. So maybe we can get into conflict specifically.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Like
You want to
resolution?
take it away and just kind of give us a little like what it like you kind of mentioned conflicts a little bit, little spiel on that, and then get into how are we handling these? How are we dealing with these conflicts that come up? And how is it related to these tracks? Like, is it that's the first trigger is the conflict type thing? Maybe just kind of clear that up.
Sure. So, a really easy way that I like to kind of separate this in my mind is to think of one-time symptoms and chronic symptoms. So, let's think about just a one-time symptom like your annual so-called flu, right? So, usually if you have more than one symptom, that means that you've experienced more than one conflict shock. And it could either be from the same conflict event or perhaps the initial, and I see this happen all the time. Say if the initial conflict that you experienced was a can't swallow conflict, okay, something that you just, a situation you couldn't swallow it, and you resolve that, because I think we do resolve, we can talk more about resolutions later, but um, I do think we're meant to naturally resolve things when we're ready to resolve them a great deal of the time. Our body knows how to resolve things. We naturally move towards resolution as we move through life. For example, things that were conflicts for you as a child, for a lot of people, they outgrow those conflicts. Something that was important to them as a little 5-year old, not wanting to leave mommy or something. Well, then when they start making friends in middle school and start being interested in the opposite gender and dating and all this stuff, well, then the conflict about being attached to mom is no longer really relevant. So a lot of times I find that, especially children, and then as they move through their life journey, we outgrow conflicts. We naturally will resolve them. So what happens with a one-time symptom, though, like a ear infection, a sore throat, sinus infection, anything like that, is that we have experienced a conflict shock and then we go into the conflict active phase. And I think Melissa goes over this too in the episode she did with you, if people want to refer back to that for a more thorough explanation. But you have the conflict shock and then you're in conflict active for as long as the conflict remains unresolved. So then you go into, when you have the moment of resolution, which can be described as when the stone falls from your soul, or when that conflict is simply no longer applicable. And one of Dr. Hammer's lecturers, his name is Helmut Pilhar, a famous quote from him is that a conflict is resolved when you can either laugh about it or you know that it cannot happen again. And so a lot of times we just naturally move to resolution when, something that seemed like a really big deal to us last week, or say a conflict that happened when we were on family vacation, and then we come back home again to the normal swing of things, and that's simply no longer relevant. And so our body is like, oh, we don't need to adapt anymore because that's no longer an applicable conflict situation. Danger, threat is past, right? And so then you start to have the healing phase symptoms, and just generally, this is when you have a higher body temperature, headache, when you have swelling, inflammation, so-called infections. This is when you have, redness, itching. Depends on the specific program that's running, what specific adaptation you're experiencing. But in the case of the can't swallow conflict, that's what would lead to a sore and inflamed throat, right? And it would hurt to swallow. That's actually evidence of that tissue repair process taking place. And so, a lot of people say if they have to go to work and they are in the healing phase, so they're feeling pretty fatigued and they have a headache and they have a sore throat, and they're like, gosh, this sucks. This stinks that I'm sick because now I have to call in from work to work. And now who's going to take care of the kids? Blah, blah, blah. Right. So you can see how that person from that symptom might then experience a stink conflict, which that's the conflict shock that would lead to an adaptation of the nasal mucosa. So that is actually what would lead to a stuffy, runny nose, right? That's what would lead to, or even a so-called sinus infection. That would be evidence of a more intense stink conflict, whereas a very mild stink conflict might look like just a little sneezing. So can you see how the initial symptom of that, the one conflict that was already resolved, already done with, then the person experiences a new conflict shock that had nothing to do with the conflict that, say, they experienced on the family vacation or something, but rather the conflict shock for that was experienced in terms of the symptoms that they were having from the initial conflict's healing phase. So, when they're having the symptom, they're like, this stinks, this sucks. And I see this cycle then with chronic symptoms too. So we talked about one-time symptoms, but then chronic symptoms, I would explain that the typical healing phase won't last longer than 6 to 8 weeks. And that would be for a more, an adaptation that went on for a longer amount of time, that had more of a higher, what we would call conflict load, which is just, it's an equation really. It's a combination of conflict intensity, how intensely that conflict impacted your psyche, and then conflict duration. So how many days, how many weeks, how many months did you remain in that conflict active state, not having found a resolution? And this might be, when you lose your job, right? And then say if it's a few months before you find a new one, and if you were in conflict active that whole time, with there's so many different potential conflicts that could come from that shocking news of, finding out you lost your job or you got fired, then that conflict, you wouldn't go into resolution until, well, we can talk about perceptual resolutions in a little bit, but the practical resolution for that would be finding a new job. And obviously, the biological purpose of that, why we would need to resolve that practically, is okay, how are you going to be able to survive and pay to feed yourself and pay the bills, right? So, it's in that case, a practical resolution is probably your best bet. So, yeah, but with the chronic symptoms, we usually are going to define this as a symptom that has come and gone for a duration of time more than 6 to 8 weeks. So if you've been dealing with a symptom on a pretty regular basis for at least like 2 months, then that's safe to say that you're stepping on tracks, right? That you are moving into resolution, but you're not actually able to fully complete that tissue repair process because you step on what we call a track, or that trigger. So you are, and of course, this can be a food, this can be a scent, this can be a person, this can be picking up your phone, right? This can be so many things, but often what I find is that you have to look at the underlying thought pattern. So for a lot of people, there's this underlying thought pattern that actually is the track. So, for example, if you're experiencing, say, if you had a self-devaluation conflict, say you're mother made, I don't know, a nasty comment to you, that you interpreted that as a self devaluation. I'm trying to think of like a specific example. Like, I don't know, your mother said something critical about your appearance or something, right? And you perceive that as a self devaluation. And with the flavor of feeling, let's say, feeling unsupported, or I feel like, oh, I feel I'm devaluing myself in terms of needing support from other people. Um, so I guess, yeah, maybe the mother critiquing appearance isn't the best example, but um, let's say there's a breakup that someone goes through, okay, and they interpret that breakup as, oh, now I feel unsupported. I'm trying to think of like a kind of generic one, but anyway, so say if they naturally kind of move through resolution and they, come to even just going to sleep and waking up the next day or something, and they eventually come to kind of resolve that underlying conflict, and they realize, oh, it is safe to accept help from other people, and I do feel supported by people in my life, and oh, my friends are bringing me food, or whatever, like I don't just need that support from a partner, I don't know, something like that. And so then you start to go into the healing phase and you start having pain. So you could start having back pain or any sort of chronic pain, okay? And so then you are having, you're in that healing phase, but then this is what becomes a very common track that I see. The track is actually about the symptom itself. So then when they have the pain, then they think, oh no, I've hurt my back, something's wrong with my back, oh no, I got to go, see the doctor, and say they do a scan and they say, oh yeah, you have degenerative changes in your back. This is something that happened to me. You have herniated discs, which I can actually tell you, my dad's a neuroradiologist, and he has told me multiple times, because I have two herniated discs in my back, and he always says, if you were to scan anyone off the street, they would probably all have herniated discs. So having a herniated disc on a MRI right in your spine does not necessarily mean that that is the source of the pain. And actually, I had experiences myself where I had doctors that were about to do surgery on me, and they were like, well, wait a minute, like when you describe the pain that you're having, it's not really lining up with what we would expect from this specific segment of spine, right? So anyway, so thankfully they stopped me from having that surgery way back when, but I'm just, kind of trying to give a generic example here. But imagine that this person then has this belief, this subconscious belief that gets, let's just say, tracked in, that their back is broken, their back is no good, I have a bad back, I'm weak. Well, guess what? Now you need even more support, right? Now you even have that story going tenfold about that I feel, not only do I feel unsupported, but I'm devaluing myself in terms of feeling like I need this support from others, because I need someone to help me carry my groceries. I need someone to help me do this and do that because I have a bad back. So it's just in its most basic form, you can see how this can become the track that they're literally thinking this thought every time that they're having that healing phase symptom. And so they're never actually able to finish out that healing phase and like turn off that program, because they keep running that program, because their psyche every single day is encountering these thoughts and these beliefs that you're operating on, that is determining it advantageous for that program, that tissue adaptation, to be able to continue running.
Yeah, sometimes we would talk about the diagnosis being like a magic spell being placed on people.
Yes.
We're kind of seeing a really good explanation and mechanism on how that's happening right now. Kind of puts you into that stuck mindset, right? Um, that's really interesting. So what's the cost of symptom suppression then? Like taking
Mm.
painkillers or taking, like in this case, if you have back pain, take a painkiller, or like, um, say taking like a anti-inflammatory, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug, if your throat is sore, stuff like that. Like what's the opportunity cost there? Is that kind of worsening the situation? Definitely, but how so?
So, my belief on this is that your beliefs about the medication or supplement or whatever it is that you're choosing to use are vastly more important than that substance itself. So, actually, what I see a lot of in the holistic world is people who are maybe they're in a lot of pain from an adaptation or an actual injury, okay? And they like refuse to take any painkillers because they're like, oh, it's so toxic. That relationship with that thing and that fear based belief of, oh, the pharmaceutical industry is out to get me, that's going to cause way more harm than good. You see where I'm going with this? Like, so in my view, your approach to taking certain things that might be helpful for you to take to maybe get some pain relief or some symptom relief. I think that it's totally fine to do that if you're approaching it from the right mindset. And so when you know the 5 biological laws, you know which phase you're in. Okay, is this an active conflict symptom? Is this a healing phase symptom? Am I in a hanging healing? Do I understand the underlying conflict? And if you do, then you're able to utilize certain interventions or different, let's say, band aid fixes, ways of supporting the body to get some symptom relief. But you're able to do that in an educated way, knowing, okay, yes, I'm in a really intense healing phase right now. And I am really suffering. So I'm going to take this substance to kind of pull myself out of the healing phase. And so in the healing phase, in nervous system lingo, that's when you're in a state of the parasympathetic state. And then when you are in the conflict active state, so before you've resolved that conflict, you are in more of a sympathetic nervous system state. So when you are in that parasympathetic state, this is when we have the vast majority of troublesome symptoms. I would say the pain, swelling, inflammation, discomfort, infection, whatever. So when you're in that healing phase, and if it's really intense, especially if oh, I was pretty conflict active for a few weeks, and you can determine this by, did you have preoccupied thinking? Did you have trouble sleeping at night? Do you have cold hands and feet? Did you lose your appetite a little bit? Do you feel like you're a little bit kind of jacked up on caffeine? If you feel those signs and symptoms of being more in conflict active, and you were in that state for a few weeks, okay, I might have a more intense healing phase. So now how can I start to downgrade it? How can I start to kind of ease into resolution? How might I be able to best support my body? And then when you do resolve the conflict, and say if you have a more intense healing phase, or if you're in a hanging healing and you haven't quite figured out how to resolve that underlying conflict, then using something like a supplement or pharmaceutical or whatever, but from the perspective of, oh, I'm going to take this ibuprofen just to kind of give myself a break, to make sure I can sleep at night, kind of ease the pain a little. But then I know that my body's going to move back into completing the healing phase. Like, I know I'm kind of temporarily taking myself out of it, and so I might be prolonging the healing phase, but sometimes, in my opinion, that's worth it.
Amazing. Wow. Yeah, what a great take on that. Mind over matter, fear is always worse than anything.
Yeah.
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 I think it's once you get into that mindset that you're like, I need this to be healthy, like
Yes.
even if it's a supplement, pharmaceutical, whatever it is, like I need this drug or supplement
Mhm.
to be healthy and whole and complete as an individual. Like that's kind of the bad way to take things and look at it, right? Like that's the thing that's gonna that dependency, right? Really interesting. Great spiel on that. That's fantastic. Yeah. Yeah. Very cool. So maybe we can get a little bit of I know you've kind of touched on, the practical versus perceptual resolutions a little bit. Maybe I could just hear like a, one versus the other, like real cookie cut and perfect.
Sure. So, simply put, practical resolution is when the external circumstance changes, whatever caused that initial conflict shock. When you're, say, if you lose your job, and then the practical resolution is getting a new job. So that's where the external circumstances are changing, and um, I'm not going to say that's the best way to resolve a conflict. That's certainly the most straightforward way and kind of tangible way to resolve a conflict. Now, a perceptual resolution is when nothing in your external world changes, but you change. Your perception of the world changes. And so, talking about the importance of the psyche and perception, how our psyche is perceiving the world around us will determine what conflicts we're even eligible to experience. And that's the way that I like to describe it. So, and I ask clients this all the time: who do you have to become to no longer be eligible to even experience this conflict? So say if they're having this separation conflict about a partner, right? I see this all the time. Usually I work with women, and they have this partner or husband or whatever that they're with, and they have this push pull energy about, well, I want to be with him, but then I don't, right? Like I want to be with him, but I'm also kind of questioning it. I don't know if he's the right one. But I don't want to break up with him. Oh, but like I want to draw him close, but I want to push him away, right? It's this push pull energy, and that's the essence of what a conflict is really this split energy. I know Melissa's described it like this. It's a split energy about anything. And so this is where I see a lot of people also getting into these chronic conflicts because they continue staying in a chronic conflict. So they have, chronic symptoms are coming from chronic conflicts. And really, if the stuff about hanging healings and tracks and triggers just feels a little overwhelming, the most basic way I can explain this is that the chronic conflicts in your life are what's causing the chronic symptoms. So, chronic conflicts equal chronic symptoms. And that is the simplest way I can put it. So, of course, that's really what it's about, is looking at, okay, where is this push pull energy at? Who would I have to become to no longer feel conflicted about this relationship that I have going on? And in that situation, I mean, they do need to take a practical step of either breaking up with the person or viewing them as, no, this is my person, I'm all in, let's work on this relationship. I am going to change my perception so that I view them in a more positive way, right? Like, what do I need to do to feel better about this, essentially? So, in that situation though, if they don't take an action, if it's like, oh, like I'm kind of with him but I'm kind of not, like if it's remaining in that split energy, they're not resolving that conflict. So really, the best way to resolve that conflict is you got to pick, right? You got to pick and commit to either staying with him or separating. So that's just one example, but you can see how this can get tricky to resolve when there is that split energy. So of course, like the first example I gave of the practical resolution, that's very cut and dry. And sometimes I have clients that do have a really great practical resolution available to them, which is so cool. I worked with one client. I think eventually I'm going to have her on the podcast that I have to share her story. But she had a tumor or a lump in her breast, and she came to see me, and it was about this specific situation. She had never told anyone about it, and that's immediately like a huge red flag for me, because I'm like, oh, when someone feels like they can't, that there's so much shame around it that they've never even told anyone else. Well, guess what? That's highlighting that emotional isolation aspect of what a conflict even is. And so even her coming to work with me was kind of a first step of like telling someone, and then this could have been a friend or someone else. It didn't need to be me, but her telling me. And so, we talked through, we found the initial conflict shock that started this adaptation for her, that, because this lump had been there for a long time. And so we looked into, okay, what's causing it to persist and to grow and then shrink a little and then grow and to continue changing. And there actually was a really kind of clear cut practical resolution available to her. I was like, okay, you need to, write this person a letter, and you need to, open up, tell your husband about this, and I kind of gave her some, little homework, and she messaged me like 2 weeks later, and she was like, I did what you said. It's like completely gone. Like the lump was just gone. She had 5 nights of night sweats because it was a endoderm program here. And this program utilizes mycobacteria in the healing phase, specifically TB bacteria. And so she said she had like 5 nights of night sweats when that cell growth that had occurred, or let's say the tumor, was being broken down, and then it was gone. And she actually had a thermogram before and after, which was cool just to see it, you know. But for her, that was that's a great example of like a practical resolution. Like she took that step, and I would say that's still part of it's still a perceptual resolution, but she was taking practical steps to facilitate that resolution. And so often, instead of keeping them so separate, I'm all about, okay, what can you do perceptually to help facilitate a practical resolution? But then from the other direction, what steps can you take practically to then also help change your mind around it, right? Like think about the people that you hang out with, your friends. That's a huge shaper of perception. The content that you consume on social media, that shapes our perception, right? How much time you spend with, the time that you spend with people in your life, they are shaping your perception. So a practical step, if the people that you're hanging out with and the content that you're consuming, what do you spend your day thinking about and doing, right? And if you're constantly focused on stuff that you don't want, and the people that you're spending time with and the content you're consuming is creating not a great outcome, and you're having a lot of chronic symptoms and stuff, well, how can you change the input to then change the output, right? Like, how can you actually take practical steps towards, let's say, hanging around people that you admire, that you want to be like, that, that are positive and that make you feel good and supported, instead of spending time around people who are complaining about all their aches and pains. That's really a huge shifter of perception. Um, and it can come down to those little decisions that you make throughout your day. Like, how can you take tangible, practical steps to facilitate a perception shift?
Amazing. There when you're talking about the perceptual shift, that's really interesting. Are you addressing it mostly cognitively? Like, are you trying to get deeper than that, like on the subconscious realm, spiritual realm? Because I'm just kind of thinking of like psychotherapy and thinking of like what's helping people actually change that perception, that worldview. So maybe you can expand a little bit on that.
Sure. Are you familiar with Dr. Bruce Lipton and the biology of belief? Yeah. Okay. So this isn't, straight GNM, but I love his work. I love his book. I think it's actually a great complement to GNM and the work I do as a practitioner. So I focus a lot on what are the subconscious beliefs that are running the show, right? What yeah, really looking at, okay, what are your subconscious beliefs? And then, okay, what can we replace those with if they're not helping you, if they're not giving you the perception you want to have? Think about, you're viewing the world through a certain lens. Well, let's get a new pair of glasses and change the lens through which we're seeing the world. And this is going to be dependent on what are those subconscious beliefs that you have programmed in. And so some people do find certain types of psychotherapy or the brain retraining or different modalities that target, rewiring the subconscious, that can absolutely be helpful to people. But then I also see some of that stuff where people are doing it and they're not getting any better. They're not getting results. And the reason why is because their individual perception. Do they believe in it? If someone believes in, I don't know, someone who is completely crazy, spewing all these different theories that have, no basis in reality or science or whatever, but someone really believes in that, I would bet you anything that would still do a lot to shift their perception and resolve conflicts. You see it a lot with even, religious beliefs, right? there isn't just one true right religion, because everyone has a different opinion on that, of course. And so, you see people from all different religions and faiths and denominations and different ways of viewing the world. And for a lot of people, if they really believe that, I think that that can be super supportive to them, based on their level of belief, really. So ultimately, I think whatever modality, whatever therapist, whatever way of thinking about the world, that they can all shift perception. But the thing is, do you really believe in it? Is that actually shifting your perception in a way that's going to help you? And so, certainly for me, learning GNM and the five biological laws has shifted my perception on health. And for a lot of people, including myself, even just learning this body of knowledge has dissolved so many chronic symptoms. Because why? Because it's changed my perception of the symptom. The symptom is no longer a bad, scary thing. And so often a lot of people are, I would say that the main conflict people are experiencing, at its most basic level, it all has to do with fear. So any fear-based thinking is going to really keep you stuck. So what beliefs can you move towards instilling? Like I believe that we get to choose the beliefs that we want to instill. We get to choose, and we have the responsibility to choose how we want to view the world around us. And is that serving us? And so ultimately, it comes down to the individual. What therapist, what modality do you feel most supported by? What most aligns with your own inner truth? What resonates the most with you as an individual? And that's why my definition of truth actually is what moves me closer to peace and away from fear. And so when I'm considering a new belief to instill or a new modality to try, right? I'm thinking about, okay, does it move me to closer to peace or fear? So a lot of people, I find they're trying different therapists. Say they go to work with a psychotherapist because they're looking for that person to fix them. Like, oh, I'm really suffering and I need to get rid of the symptoms. So I'm going to go to them and so that they can fix me, right? So what do you think that relationship with that person, what's going to be the output of that? If that connection or choosing to work with that person is based in fear, then my guess is it's not going to go in the direction you're probably thinking it's going to go in. So, same thing with different modalities. If you're running to get this new biohacking device thinking that, oh, this is going to fix me, right? Oh, my body needs this to detox. That's still ultimately fear based. So again, if I wanted to do, I don't know, use red light or get a massage, it's like, oh, it feels really good. It feels supportive. I love how I feel after I use it. That's more the vibe, right? That's the direction I want to go in. And that's, even if it's someone that I'm wanting to work with to help get a different perspective on the conflicts I'm dealing with. And I want to talk through some stuff, because conflicts are normal, guys. Like we're going to experience conflicts through our life. We can't avoid them, right? We can build resiliency, I think, to have maybe less intense conflicts. And this is where overall health and wellness, I think, comes in. We can become more resilient, but we can't avoid them. It's part of life, and it's biologically meaningful and sensical, and it's our body's way of kind of giving us a system upgrade. So, in that view, if I'm dealing with a conflict and I'm like, this is becoming a chronic conflict for me. Like I haven't found a way to either practically resolve it or to shift my perception around it, and I'm struggling with that. Then yeah, I would consider going to a trusted, probably a fellow GNM practitioner of some sort and getting some support and saying, hey, can you help me view this in a different way? Can you give me your outside perspective on this? Because maybe something they say is going to cause me to go, I hadn't thought of it in that way. That's a great idea. That's a great view of that. And it might help me have this perception shift to be able to resolve that.
Well put. Yeah. Yeah, I'm just thinking like that attunement piece from the practitioner is really important, right? Attuning to the client, to their needs, to their worldview, and um, it kind of just brings up a thought in my head here, when working with a practitioner, I don't necessarily demonize that either. And
Mhm.
but that perception that you're talking about, are they going to fix me? They need to fix me, whatever. That's the more harmful view here. And I think it's really important to go see a practitioner that doesn't think that they're gonna fix you.
Right. Oh,
I
yeah.
think that's a
Yeah.
huge piece, because a lot of the ego involved there too, I'm a whatever and I can heal you. Well, everyone
Mhm.
heals themselves, and if your practitioner doesn't know that, avoid them.
Yeah. Do they view that your body is broken, right? Do they view symptoms as a sign that your body's going haywire and malfunctioning? Um, yeah, totally.
Amazing. Well, I think now might be a good time to ask for your final thoughts on the episode. Anything you wanna add? Anything you wanna that we might have missed? Now's the time to bring it up
Wow, yeah, we were going, like, all over the place.
a little bit.
Yeah, I think just emphasizing, because I'm sure a lot of your listeners are very familiar with the holistic realm, and I find that a common misconception when learning German new medicine and realizing that this new GNM paradigm, this way of viewing health in the body, is so drastically different from the holistic paradigm that they have this, let's say, I don't know, identity crisis of like, oh, so do I just have to discard all of that? Right? Like, what do I do with that? Like, my supplements and my biohacking, like what do I do? Like I'm having this existential crisis here, which by the way can lead to a new conflict. Um, so, when learning GNM, and that's what I really recommend that people do is learn this knowledge for themselves, learn the framework, you'll find that, you can still enjoy eating healthy food, reducing, yeah, let's say toxic exposure, because I'm sure that's not overall like the best thing to support health and resiliency. I think we know that we're dealing with a lot of substances in our modern world that are not really biologically natural. So I think it's okay to acknowledge that and acknowledge that certain things can be quite supportive for the body without approaching it from a fear based perspective where, like, I need this stuff to fix me, or that this toxic exposure, these bad foods are the cause of disease. Because again, you have people that eat not super great diet and don't do anything to reduce toxic exposure and just living really mainstream normal life eating McDonald's every day and are totally healthy and fine, right? Probably because in their mind it's not a problem. Like, it's not, that's not a big deal for them, and they're really chill and they're just kind of this, look at their personality. The people that that don't have chronic health symptoms, that just kind of eat whatever, do whatever, pay attention to, okay, how are they viewing the world? What's the language they're using? How are they talking about themselves and their bodies? Just as a side note, but really all this stuff in the holistic world, because that paradigm is so different, because it is very similar, I think, to the conventional paradigm in which there's a bad guy out to get you. There's the external baddies. There's the things to fight against. Let's boost the immune system. And actually, when you learn GNM, you realize that the concept of an immune system is non-existent, right? So, which that's a whole different topic. But anyway, you realize that in the holistic world, the toxins are the new viruses or something, right? Like, it's a new bad guy to fight. And so can you step into the GNM paradigm and play around with that and see how it feels and try it on, right? It's like trying on a pair of glasses. How does that feel? And so once you learn this framework and you understand that, oh, the conflicts that I'm experiencing in my life, which is coming from how I'm viewing the world around me, that's what's leading to these tissue adaptations, which create symptoms. So when you have that new kind of fundamental piece of knowledge, how can we then, knowing the law of two phases and knowing it where we're at in that tissue restoration process, oh, wow, eating this way during this phase makes me feel really good and supported. And when I get enough sleep and when I'm, taking care of myself and exercising and, living a more, let's say, biologically natural lifestyle, I'm more resilient and I feel less prone to conflicts. And, or when I experience conflicts, they're perhaps less intense. I'm in a more resilient place mentally, like using the physical to kind of boost the mental, right? But fundamentally, when you have two people or a whole family, let's say, living in a house that has toxic mold, the toxic mold is not the cause of the symptoms. Like, it could be a track, but it is not in and of itself causing symptoms if it's not affecting everyone equally. And that's where with GNM we deal with like there can't be any exceptions. So, that toxic substance, for something to be a true toxin, it would have to affect everyone equally based on factors like weight and height and stuff like that. But that's where we're like, oh, okay. And even with foods and stuff, right? People that they claim that this food causes cancer, no, this causes cancer, this causes cancer. But even with the people that have cancer, why the different types of cancer? One person that had a really toxic life and a bad diet and all this stuff, they get breast cancer, and another person gets lung cancer. Well, why the difference? Or people that lived in a close proximity to a cell tower, not everyone's getting cancer, and even then it's not even the same type. So it has to make sense that the body adapts following a predictable pattern, following, let's say, a map. So ultimately, when you're looking at that holistic paradigm and you're looking at the GNM paradigm, when you're transitioning paradigms, you don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater, I guess is what I'm trying to say. You can still do things that feel supportive to you and that, are helping your kind of overall health and wellness and resiliency without connecting those things, or rather lack of doing those things, with specific symptoms and disease.
Well, you're absolutely bang on with everything that you're saying here. It's truly amazing. Especially that piece on I really appreciate this most, the piece about toxins not affecting people like in a standard way based on all these physiological factors. I think that's a very, very important point to stress. It's exactly what we're talking about with the flaws in materialism and empiricism and
Mm.
things of that nature. Um, it kind of, when you get into the depths of it, people jump from that, blame the germ, blame the toxin, and then everyone kind of realizes eventually, well, maybe these have less to do with it than we thought,
Yeah.
which is
Or
kind of a
even,
hard little hill to get over.
yeah. Or
Sorry.
like we were saying at the very beginning, blaming the bad emotion, blaming the
Yeah,
bad
blaming the bad
trauma,
emotion.
right?
Mhm. Absolutely. Yeah, amazing, amazing. One thing I've noticed that you brought up, is when looking at people who live long lives, like centurions, things of that
Mhm.
nature. Again, they could drink Coke every single day and, toxin, right? And, eat a standard American diet, seed oils, whatever it is, whatever thing you wanna demonize. There are people who live very long, healthy lives who consume this stuff all the time. What I notice is always a strong mind, resilience,
Mhm. Yeah.
like a positive outlook, a strong spiritual connection,
Mhm.
faith and hope, and um, there is no fear. They it doesn't serve them, and they don't serve it. They could care less about that. They're resilient, and I think that's one of the things that I notice in really healthy individuals and people who live very long lives. And honestly, I think that is the fundamental key secret to longevity. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. No, that's great. And so people learning about GNM, obviously this episode is a great starting point. Any other resources that you would like to share on where to kind of get into this? Moving from maybe this episode. Melissa Sal's episode was great too. Go
Yeah,
back and
no, it
listen to that
was.
one.
Yeah, definitely listen to that one. So
Yeah.
I'm a really big fan of learning through podcasts, and I do have my own podcast with my co-host Ashley that's called Freedom from Fear, a German new medicine podcast, and that um, actually starts specifically with episodes 5, 6, 2, and 3 in that order for a really good bite-sized crash course in GNM basics and fundamentals, and we go into the history of it. And so if this piques your interest, I would check that out. All the podcast, the link to the podcast can be found on my website, which is abigailpuccioni.com. I also have different offerings, coaching offerings for I actually don't really like to consider myself a coach. I consider myself more of a GNM educator, where I educate you on the root cause of your symptom if you want to see this from a new perspective. So if you'd like a little extra support, I do offer that. You can also connect with me on Instagram. I try to provide, some bite-sized education there in my content. It's AJ Puccioni, which I'm sure will be in the podcast description. So I'm not going to spell that out. But yeah, I also do have a GNM mentorship program where I basically created a very thorough, comprehensive, advanced education in German new medicine for those really wanting to dive into the nitty gritty and get a really thorough education in GNM. And this is specifically geared towards holistic practitioners who would like to integrate the GNM paradigm and framework into perhaps the work that they're already doing. So again, even if they're, using a certain modality or doing a certain type of psychotherapy or brain retraining, or whatever they specialize in, a massage therapist or a lymphatic massage therapist or a breathwork facilitator, learning the GNM framework and getting a really thorough, deep dive education in that. But then we're focusing on how to actually integrate that into your practice and how to kind of incorporate, the GNM framework into your offerings so that you can do what you do best and what you're passionate about and what you're trained in already, perhaps, but from a new, I would say, more empowering perspective of health. So I do offer that. So you can just reach out to me if you're interested on Instagram. I don't have anything about that publicly on my site. You just have to reach out to me. But yeah, I also have a free GNM resources PDF that if you shoot me a DM, I'd be happy to email that to you. And that has some of my different free or low cost resources for self-study.
Amazing. Wow. Well, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for coming on and sharing all this
Yeah.
beautiful wisdom with us. It was an amazing episode.
Thank you.
Certainly. And I want to thank you all for listening. You should all know that this is not medical advice or psychotherapeutic advice or anything of that nature. It's for your informational purposes only. But also remember that we're all responsible, sovereign beings capable of thinking and criticizing and understanding absolutely anything. We, the people in the greater forest, are together self healers, self governable, self teachers, and so much more. Make sure to reach out if you have any questions, criticism, comments, concerns. Love chatting with you all. You all have great comments on the episodes. You guys help me learn more every single day, every single message that I get. You guys are awesome. Love you all. Really appreciate you all for taking the time to listen. If you did enjoy this, give us a like, share, comment, subscribe, whatever you got to do on the platform you're on. If you're listening to a podcast, leave us a review. That'd be really, really much appreciated. And just remember, if there are two types of people in the world, those believe they can, those believe they can't. And of course, they're both correct. Thanks for listening, guys. Take care.